This is The Other Side with Damien Coury.
G'day and welcome to episode 5 of The Other Side Australia for the week commencing Friday, September 25, 2020. I'm Damien Coury. We're going to skip our usual format. Alexandra Marshall and Ray Radowski will be back with us next week. And today we're going to take a deep dive on the issue of herd immunity. Just what are the experts saying now about the risks and about maybe even the need for herd immunity? We'll hear parts of one of the latest interviews with Sweden's chief government epidemiologist, the man responsible for the no forced lockdown strategy. And then we'll hear from two of America's top experts on COVID-19 and its spread. These are interviews you do not want to miss. The word draconian has been made acceptable lately. We need draconian laws to manage this crisis, we're told. That, of course, is nonsense. COVID-19 can be managed without extreme laws being attached to the government response. But even in terms of this new, dangerously obedient, government-loving Australia we live in, where we accept draconian laws and applaud our leaders with very high approval ratings for bringing them upon us, even in these scary times, these laws are really draconian in the very, very worst sense of the word. So what's in this bill that's now already being passed by the lower house of the Victorian State Parliament, because Labor has the majority there, and now has to pass through the upper house, where smaller parties hold the balance of power in a couple of weeks? The Omnibus Emergency Measures Bill. Omnibus, there's a word you don't hear much anymore, means containing many things. The Omnibus Emergency Measures Bill allows the government to recruit what will be called designated authorised officers. These public servants with a badge, and sometimes maybe not even public servants, would have the power to come into your house and arrest you and put you in jail, without a trial and without a warrant. As the Age newspaper put it, the bill, quote, hands power to Health Department appointed authorised officers to detain anyone they, quote, reasonably believe may negligently spread the virus. These officers will be public servants, Health Department officials, or, get this, anyone appointed by the Health Department. Wow. They can come into your house and arrest you. Probably in front of your kids and in your pajamas. And even if you haven't said anything on social media yet, but the authorised officer thinks that you maybe will tomorrow. And there is the really disturbing bit that should have every sane person in the nation on the streets in protest if it wasn't already a crime to hit the streets in protest. They can take you away and put you in jail even if you haven't done anything wrong. Let that sink in for a second. All they have to do is say that they believe you are likely to commit an offence in the future. Maybe. But it's okay, says Dan Andrews. These officers have to have appropriate skills. Well, those skills are very, very broadly defined in the legislation. And I guess given Dan's success with security guards, he thinks this might be the right thing to keep on doing and that we should trust his judgment about who to hand these draconian powers to. Now, there have been a lot of Dan Andrews supporters on social media decrying his critics for calling him Dictator Dan. But that name now truly fits. It's terrifying. There have also been a lot of Andrews supporters on social media saying that it's childish to call Victoria a police state. Not wanting to be included among the many childish humans on Twitter, I decided to look up the generally accepted definition of a police state. I grew up in Joh Bjelke-Petersen's Queensland, after all, and as a young, idealistic 20-something, I'd campaigned against his police special branch, the secret police in their white shirts, some of whom, the nastier ones, would go around planting drugs on uni students and arresting them back in the 1980s, and then verballing them by making up things they'd never said and claiming them as true in court. Those were not good times to disagree with the government in Queensland. Imagine Anastasia Palaszczuk, Jackie Trad and Jeanette Young with their own dodgy police force. You get the picture. Now, Joe was a great job creator, business builder. He did a lot for Queensland, but he was no Liberal. And now we have this lovely legislation from an authoritarian Labor government this time. Unlike Queensland, though, which only has one House of Parliament, one chamber, Victoria has an upper house, the Legislative Council. And the bill has to pass the Legislative Council before it becomes law. But it's already got Labor's stamp of approval in the lower house. Anyway, back to the definition of a police state. Wikipedia defines a police state as a government that exercises power through the power of the police force. Since the beginning of the 20th century, says Wikipedia, it has taken on an emotional and derogatory meaning by describing an undesirable state of living characterized by the overbearing presence of the civil authorities. Sounds like COVID-19 Dan Andrews Victoria to me. I think he passes the police state definition test.
This is The Other Side with Damien Curry, a new podcast for the quiet Australians. Tell your friends to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, and all major podcast platforms.
Something popped up in my YouTube feed the other day that I watched and was just blown away because of the connection with what's going on in Australia at the moment. And it's a lecture being given to a bunch of students by Professor Jordan Peterson called Why Hitler Bathed Even More Than You Think. I'm not going to say any more than that. I'll just leave it for you to make up your own mind and have a little listen to what Dr. Peterson says.
The dictator wants to impose strict uniformity on the entire population. That's order. Order. And one of the things we've discovered that's really interesting is that disgust sensitivity is associated with orderliness, and that's associated with conscientiousness. And one of the things about Hitler was that he was very disgust sensitive. And if you read Hitler's Table Talk, which is a collection of his spontaneous dinner speeches from 1939 to 1942, you see that his metaphor for the Aryan race was a body, a pure body, unassaulted by parasites or predators, and that he was trying to erect a border around it to keep all of that away. So it's an immunological disgust-like metaphor. And there's some recent work that was published in PLOS One about 3 years ago showing that if you went around and sampled political attitudes in different countries, or even within the same country, what you found was that the higher the prevalence of infectious diseases, the higher the probability of totalitarian political attitudes at the local level. And you can imagine, well, what happens if there's infectious diseases is you want to put borders around everything. You don't want free movement between ideas or people, because that's partly how the disease spreads. And before Hitler went on his rampage against the non-Aryans, he cleaned up all the factories. Like, he went in there and fumigated them. It was part of the law. And he went on a public health campaign to get rid of tuberculosis, and he got rid of the bugs in the factories as well. And he used Zyklon B. That's an insecticide, and that's the gas that he used in the gas chambers eventually. So first it was the bugs in the rats, and then it was people who were, then it was euthanasia. That was the next move, and forced euthanasia. And the rationale for that was compassion, by the way, just so you all know. It's low openness and high orderliness, and that looks like it's associated with disgust, and that looks like it's associated with something called the extended immune system, which is the proclivity of people to keep themselves away from potential sources of contamination. It's really terrifying, because one of the things people often said about Germany was that, you know, it was a very civilized country, and yet it descended into barbarity.
And that's Professor Jordan Peterson in a video called Why Hitler Bathed Even More Than You Think. Check it out. It's on YouTube. I'll put the link in the program notes. "18 QCs came out to condemn the proposed laws this week. That's the very senior level of barristers known as Queen's Counsels, the really smart ones, including a former High Court judge and 2 former federal court judges. They warned that the emergency measures would result in unprecedented excessive powers. And then, on Wednesday, Wendy Harris QC, the president of the Victorian Bar Association, the official body representing all the state's barristers, wrote to the Andrews government to warn that the new laws could breach the state's human rights charter and allow citizens to be placed in arbitrary detention. Harris said, quote, potentially untrained and unprofessional people appointed as authorised officers would be enforcing rules that cannot be justified. Unconstrained and undefined subjective powers naturally invite the tendency to exercise them to the fullest and in breach of human rights. Yeah, no kidding. Give a public servant a badge and some authority, and you think they're not going to miss the chance to play real-life cops and robbers? The Vice President of the Australian Bar Association, the National Bar Association, Matthew Collins QC, said that the ABA shares the concerns expressed by the Victorian Bar. Well, the lawyers are all, quite understandably, very professional and very polite. But let's get this clear. This bill is an abomination of everything it means to live in a free, liberal, democratic nation. The mere fact that the Labor Party could even suggest laws like this should be of deep, deep concern to anybody, and especially those who traditionally vote Labor. The failure of the federal government to step in and stop this is also quite disgraceful. They probably want to stretch it out and get as much political benefit as they can out of this terrible, terribly stupid political move by Dan Andrews. But I'm afraid there's just no excuse. The Constitution gives the federal parliament the power to pass laws that override state laws. It's simple. We shouldn't have to beg ScoMo. We put you in power for a reason. You won the leadership and the election on ideological grounds. Step up.
Our deep dive on herd immunity and the man who's running Sweden's controversial no forced lockdown approach to managing COVID is coming up next. If you'd like to support the podcast, help us grow and support the sharing of classical liberal and non-left-wing ideas and takes on the news, and most importantly, help keep Elliot, the assistant producer, paid, hop on to subscribestar.com. That's subscribestar.com. All one word, Subscribestar, and search up The Other Side or Damien Curry, and you can sponsor us for as little as $5 a month. That's roughly a teaspoon of a flat white every day. Much better value than the ABC. What is herd immunity? Herd immunity happens when a community is protected from a virus because a large enough number of people in that community have already had the virus or have been vaccinated against it. When coronavirus COVID-19 started, it was new, or novel, as they call it. So nobody was immune, and it could have spread like wildfire. But as more and more people get immunity, a virus finds it harder and harder to spread until it finally dies out. The question is, what percentage of a community have to have the antibodies and T cells required to give them immunity before the thing will die out altogether? Sweden is probably the country that's famously come closest to a herd immunity type of approach. They had no forced lockdown. They kept schools and most businesses, including restaurants, open. But of course, lots of people did stay home, and they encouraged work from home, and they banned really big gatherings like sports events and concerts. The man in charge of advising the government of Sweden on its policy was Dr. Anders Tegnell, and he says a really rapid slowdown in the spread of COVID-19 means the country has reached a high level of immunity. But Sweden has had about 580 deaths per million people. That's a heck of a lot more than its Nordic neighbours. That would be like Australia having 14,000 deaths in the early stages of COVID-19. The big question is this: has it now left Sweden any better protected, any better off? Anders Tegnell, Sweden's equivalent of our CMO, spoke to French state TV, France 24's English language channel, this week.
I think at the moment we are very happy with the strategy. The number of cases has fallen in Sweden during the last couple of months. We're now down to very low levels. Lower levels than most countries in Europe actually right now. Our mortality has gone down to almost zero. We have very few cases in intensive care and almost no cases in our hospitals anymore.
The figures of new cases per day are extremely low in the country, around a 20th of what we have in France, for example, or other European countries. Do you think that is something that is going to be sustained, that it is going to carry on like that?
I think we're reasonably confident that it can be sustained because we are building this on the same kind of strategy that we'll be using all through this pandemic, trying to get people to stay at home when they're sick, working from home as much as possible, keeping distance in the society. And that staying with the same strategy means that we can keep on having this strategy also through the fall.
The difference in Sweden's approach is how they treat their people. They don't force anyone to do all of these things. They respect the principles of liberalism and allow social pressure and people's good sense to regulate behaviour, rather than heavy policing and fining their people. In this way, trust is built rather than destroyed.
And that's why we started with this kind of voluntary strategy, giving a lot of influence to the population, giving them a lot of responsibility, the same way we do in many other areas, and which we know works quite well because there's a high level of confidence between the population and the agency. And since we started with that, we managed to keep the number of cases reasonably low all through. We managed to keep our healthcare system running with a high level of quality of care, and there was always free beds for any COVID-19 case in the hospitals. We never were really pressured to do a drastic thing like closing down society, especially since we know that closing down society will have a lot of negative effects on public health in many other areas, except for the COVID-19.
But this strategy has had a cost in human lives. I'm thinking of all the Swedes. I mean, you have pretty much, on average, around 10 times the mortality rates that your neighboring countries have had, Norway or Finland. And is this not due to this strategy?
No, there's not complete a connection to that, because I mean you can look at countries like Belgium, Netherlands and France who have similar mortality rates compared to Sweden. Sweden had a very heavy epidemic very early on, much heavier than many of our neighboring countries, with a very heavy startup. So that, I think, influenced the spread in Sweden very much and made our pandemic look much more like the pandemic in the UK or in France and many other countries, and not comparable to Norway and Finland. Furthermore, we can tell that with the same strategy now, since the last 2-3 months, we see almost no cases in our elderly homes, and our mortality rate has been very low for several months already. So there is definitely not a close connection between the strategy and the mortality rate. This was very much due to a high level of mortality in our elderly homes, long-term care facilities, which had weaknesses, not everywhere, but in a number of places that made it possible for the disease to spread very much in those places. And we know from every country that if you get a high level of incidence of disease in those places, you get a high mortality because the people living there are the most likely to die from this disease.
But you did say, so for you there is no correlation between these high figures and the
I don't say there is no correlation at all, but I don't say that there is a clear correlation, because we have been able to run this strategy with a very low level of mortality and very low level of incidence in these long-term care facilities. Of course, something went wrong when 5,800 people died. That's definitely not something we expected, nothing we planned for, nothing we hoped for. So that's definitely gone wrong. But that does not mean that the strategy in itself has gone wrong.
Sweden also doesn't impose face masks or even recommend them. Dr. Tegnell told France 24's English language channel that with case numbers falling, there's no need to introduce more measures.
Especially not measures where the quality of evidence is very low. I mean, any kind of review you read about face masks, everybody agrees that the evidence is very weak for the effect. And if there is effect, it's probably not very big. But I can understand that in some countries where you have an increasing spread, you have a widespread in the population, you need to take on even measures that are not the best ones. We can stick with the best measures so far, and the best measures is to have a social distancing, stay at home when you're sick, and trying to work from home. Those measures are definitely a lot more effective than face masks.
Tegnell flatly rejected the notion that the Swedish policy was about getting people infected to achieve herd immunity.
We try to slow down the spread of the virus as much as anybody else in any other country. And we managed to slow it down just as much as most other countries. It took slightly longer than a few other countries. On the other hand, we don't have the resurgence of the disease that those countries have. So in the end, we will see how much difference it will make to have a more a strategy that's more sustainable and that you can keep in place for a long time, instead of have a strategy that means that you lock down, open and lock down over and over again.
Do you think Sweden has got over the hump? Do you think it's over here?
No, it's not over for anybody. This is a disease that's going to be with us for a long time, and we're going to have to adapt to it in different ways over this time.
That's the man in charge of Sweden's response to COVID-19. Chief Epidemiologist Dr. Anders Tegnell speaking to France 24 English. That interview is available in full on YouTube, and we'll put the link in the program notes.
This is The Other Side with Damien Curry, a new podcast for the quiet Australians. Tell your friends to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, and all major podcast platforms.
The virus seems to follow a similar pattern in a lot of places. We reported in episode 2 of the podcast that an analysis done in the United States between states that had a hard lockdown and states that didn't showed that lockdowns didn't seem to have much effect on the rate of spread of the virus or the number of fatalities. In fact, that study showed that the only factor seemed to be the amount of public transport a city has. Most places that have had one very big wave of the virus have only had small waves after that, if any, and with far fewer fatalities per infection. This means it could be that herd immunity is kicking in at a very low community infection rate. Some experts think it might only need to be at around 10 to 20%. Others say at least 60 to 70% is required. The World Health Organization has put Irish doctor Michael Ryan in charge of its health emergencies program. Dr. Ryan made it very clear in a statement last month that herd immunity was a long way off.
Now, as a planet, as a global population, we are nowhere close to the levels of immunity required to stop this disease transmitting. And we need to focus on what we can actually do now to suppress transmission and not live in hope of herd immunity being our salvation. Right now, that is not a solution. And it's not a solution we should be looking to for our salvation.
That was the World Health Organization's head of health emergencies, Dr. Michael Ryan, speaking on August 18. Well, back in May, Prime Minister Scott Morrison labelled pursuing herd immunity a death sentence. So where are we at now? If herd immunity is required to eliminate COVID, then the only state in Australia that may soon be safe would be Victoria. And if no vaccine is forthcoming, might the rest of us have to face a first real wave like Victoria has? Tyler Cohen is a leading economics professor at the US George Mason University in Virginia. He writes the Economic Scene column for the New York Times and is a regular opinion columnist for Bloomberg. He was ranked at number 72 among the top 100 global thinkers in 2011 by Foreign Policy magazine. He's exceptionally good with numbers, to say the least. Professor Cohen spoke with Freddie Sayers on the British podcast Unheard earlier this month in a fascinating interview. Sayers started by asking Cohen whether we were underrating or overrating the real risk posed by COVID-19.
It depends where you are and exactly when you're talking about. So if you mean England right now at this moment, very late in August, most people probably are overrating the risk. That said, there are many parts of the world, including my own country, the United States, where people are still underrating the risk. They don't use masks. They don't take basic precautions. They go to bars inside. To me, that's quite reckless.
Cohen then went on to talk about the concept of phantom risk, where the actual risk can be replaced by a kind of cultural perception of risk.
Well, we see this also happening with terrorist attacks. Before 9/11, clearly people underrated the risk that terrorists would take box cutters and commandeer airplanes and crash them into buildings, right? It was a terrible mistake. But after the attack happened, for a long time, possibly even still now, people overrate that risk because it has become salient to them. So one of the biggest problems of recovering from COVID-19, when that point comes around, is that people will consider the mere existence of cases a reason to panic, and that will thwart the resumption of economic activity.
Sound familiar? That's Professor Tyler Cohen of George Mason University in the US speaking with Freddie Sayers on the British podcast Unheard. Professor Cohen said the time had come, in the US at least, for governments to stop promoting and enhancing the risk, but to now reassure people on safety. He says the one area that has the most potential for success that governments should be focusing on is biomedical research.
And I would like to see my government and also yours do everything possible to accelerate that work, and in particular be ready on the side of distribution and have prepaid contracts up front with biomedical institutions doing the work that will save lives and make it safe for business to reopen. And it seems to me that is the thing we're doing that is working.
As a crisis communications expert by trade, I couldn't help but cheer when Professor Cohen made this point about the way governments need to communicate to get people on board.
The way you get people to actually obey mandates is not to scold them. So the left wing in my country, I feel, in some ways has been counterproductive. The way you get people to obey mandates is first to be clear and to be non-threatening and non-panicky, and then to express your own vulnerability and present the mandate in the form of a request that you do not wish to be endangered in a gentle way, rather than scolding or lecturing.
Couldn't our state and federal leadership take a few lessons from that? Certainly the way to get people on board is not to fine them ridiculous amounts of money and threaten them at every turn and turn the police loose on them like some excessive police state. Cohen said that there should be studies and data and modelling done now on the dangers of not opening up. But, as seems to be the case here in Australia, politics is getting in the way of sensible policy in the USA. Cohen made it more than clear that he's no fan of Donald Trump, but he said the left are being utterly absurd in rejecting every suggestion that Trump makes and making things like exploring herd immunity sensibly and looking for a cure or a vaccine no-go zones for public discussion. Freddie Sayers then raised the question of herd immunity with Cohen. Here's Freddie.
You know, I just spent time in Sweden, and there, Anders Tegnell, who is their epidemiologist, he believes that the numbers coming down so low in Sweden are at least partially the result of immunities building up. Do you buy that?
I think we need to be very careful. So possibly a few regions have some kind of herd immunity. That would include southern England, many parts of Sweden, possibly Madrid, possibly Lombardy, possibly New York City. I call it semi-herd immunity or imperfect herd immunity because we don't know how permanent it will be. So one micro foundations for herd immunity is that you have these super spreaders, and once they are taken care of, they have an immune response or they're somehow removed from the system. Some of them even may die. One possibility is then you're simply pretty safe ongoing. But another possibility is that the potential super spreaders rotate over time. And as winter comes, as your social configurations change, as offices reopen, in essence, new individuals step into those super spreader roles and your temporary herd immunity configuration is gone. Now, I think we don't know. Again, I want more data. I want there to be a kind of social and scientific obsession with answering that question. I know it's not easy. So I'm not sure about herd immunity, but I do feel in the United States in particular, it has been under-discussed for a long time for political reasons. And say the New York Times only in August starts to seriously consider different notions of herd immunity. But as you said, it's a very well-known scientific concept.
One thing Professor Cohen says countries like Australia are going to have to watch out for is the impact of tourism on herd immunity as they open up.
You could lose your semi-herd immunity through the arrival of tourism. I wouldn't say that's the biggest risk for Sweden, but certainly it's an issue. So I also worry about the people who have pushed herd immunity ideas Some of them are responsible, but many of them do not talk probabilistically enough. And there's a kind of once and for allism, like when Michael Levitt will just say on Twitter, "It's over," like 2-word sentence. Nassim Taleb's critique of Levitt, that he won't think probabilistically, is essentially correct. And it's irresponsible when people push the herd immunity idea without also putting forward its possible limitations.
The Michael Levitt that Professor Cohen was just referring to is Michael Levitt, the 2013 Nobel laureate for chemistry and professor of structural biology at Stanford University's School of Medicine. Levitt has been very high profile in critiquing the public policy response to COVID-19. He insists that the only data we really should be focused on is excess death data compared to other years. He spoke to Unheard's Freddie Sayers at the end of August.
I keep on coming back to the fact that of all the viral diseases we've ever had, only one disease has been tested as much as this. We have done millions and millions of tests for the RNA in the virus. If we would have done exactly the same thing in 2017, the number of flu deaths would be much, much higher than the current number of COVID deaths, because flu is so widespread. In other words, normally diseases are looked at by symptoms. Are you coughing in a certain way? Do you have a fever? Have you lost your sense of smell? Those are all fine. But if you simply say, is the virus on you?
So this goes to the whole question of how it can ever end. Is it your view then that the virus is going to be around for a long time, maybe even forever? We will have fluctuating degrees of numbers of cases. Will those curves that we've put on the board ever go to zero?
So I think at some point we need to either make curves like that for influenza, and when people say, "Oh, I didn't realize influenza was so terrible, and I didn't get upset about it, therefore why am I getting upset about something which is as lethal a disease, but is even occurring more or less?" So again, having a comparison. Panic comes from when you don't know what to expect. And in COVID, because of the method of testing, we had no idea what to expect. I think that at some point, we're going to get tired of testing. It's a huge waste of money. This money could much, much better go to helping people who've lost their jobs, homeless people, on which the streets of London are very full these days. And it's great for the pharmaceutical companies selling test kits, but it's not doing anything, because you could find influenza, for example, how many people died of COVID and influenza? And why did we quite say they died from COVID, not from influenza? It's not a meaningful thing. Excess death is meaningful. And it's not just the number of excess deaths, it's the age range. If there had been 180,000 excess deaths in Europe, and they'd all been under 50, this would be a major, major disaster. And again, I'm not in any way trying to say that the death of an 85-year-old is different from the death of a 5-year-old. One has had their life, one wants to have their life, but there is an asymmetry here. It's in this age of PC, in the past we would have simply said, years of life lost. In this case it's 0, in this case it's 85, add them up. And medical systems do that. But nowadays, for PC, you don't say that. So it's the age range of the deaths and their number. They are comparable in number to flu, and the age range is exactly like flu. Again, in COVID, it's important to remember this and to remember it. 50% are over 85, and less than 10% are under 65. And almost all have comorbidities. I don't know about comorbidities with influenza, but the age ranges are exactly the same.
I mean, the argument doesn't have political purchase for obvious reasons. That everyone, a lot of people are within those vulnerable groups, and even people who aren't have parents and grandparents who are. So, I don't think it's going to win the argument to say, well, they're old, so we should think about it differently.
I accept that, except that if I went to the health service in the United States or anywhere saying, look, I want a new heart. I'm important, give me a new heart. They'd say, well, look, we give new hearts to people who are young so they can use it for a long time. Equally well, the National Health System has a very precise number of how much is worth investing in an old person's health. So all of this is just doublespeak. I mean, it's politically inappropriate, but ultimately, for me personally, the value, my life, is much, much less valuable than the life of my grandchildren.
That's the Nobel laureate for chemistry 2013, Michael Levitt from Stanford University, speaking to Unheard's lockdown TV program at the end of August. So what was Dr. Levitt's prediction as Europe and the Northern Hemisphere heads into winter?
One of my friends who's a virologist, I got into this at the end of January. He said, don't worry, coronaviruses, we have many of them. Common colds are coronaviruses, and they have a tendency to become less lethal. So I don't know, that could be wrong. But I think if you combine that with the upcoming news that I'm sure you're very well aware of that the herd immunity may be occurring at 20%, not at 80%, because of T-cell immunity. We basically have learned to live with coronaviruses by recognizing a cell that is making any coronavirus and killing it, rather than waiting for the virus to express itself on the surface of the cell and create antibodies. So if these things are true, and it seems that these things were questions in February, but have all become true. I just got an email saying that Manaus in Brazil was a disaster situation, reached 20% and stopped. And that's important because it's in the southern hemisphere. It's in its winter season. So if we take that as a data point, I still feel very confident, but aware that I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not the Oracle of Delphi.
That's Professor Michael Levitt speaking to Freddie Sayers of the Unheard website and their podcast Lockdown TV. Well worth checking out. The full interview is about 45 minutes. I'll put the link in the program notes today so you can go and check that out.
The best way to get the podcast is to have it emailed to you. To get on our mailing list, simply drop us a line at theotherside@gmail.com. That's the other side, AUST, all one word, @gmail.com.
And that wraps up the show for another week. Thank you very much for listening right through, and thank you very much for telling your friends and subscribing. That subscribing thing is kind of important because it does mean eventually I might get paid, apparently, if I get something like 10,000 subscribers. So a bit of a way off yet, but every little bit helps, if you know what I mean. So please tell your friends. Also, if you'd like to get onto Subscribe Star, you can buy me a cup of coffee on that platform by signing up for a $5 a week subscription, $5 a month subscription, I'm sorry, not $5 a week, $5 a month. And that would be great support as well. Thank you guys. Have a great week. We will catch you next week on the other side, Australia.